Today we'll cover the rest of the Reconstruction component of our unit. We'll discuss what sharecropping is, also the increase in Black politicians, the introduction of the 15th Amendment, limiting rights, and then also the first civil rights movement that our country has seen. Sharecropping was a way that African Americans could possibly make money if they couldn't find jobs after they were granted their freedom. They would do pretty much the same job that they did as slaves, but they would be able to work a piece of land for farmers in exchange for part of the profits. They also had to pay for rent for their supplies to work that land, and also for any clothes or anything else that they needed. They bought these items on credit from the farmers and had to pay it back. The idea was that they would pay it back after they're paid. So credit, it's kind of like a credit card where you're not paying with actual money, but you'll be billed later on. In most cases, the share of that part of land did not create enough profit for the sharecroppers to pay back their debts to the farmers. So they weren't able to pay for the rent, supplies, and clothes. So they definitely didn't have enough money to actually make an income and provide for their families. So it created this cycle of debt that almost made them end up in the same exact place as slavery to begin with. There's an increase in political participation of African Americans. This chart shows you a comparison of participation by race. As you can see, in most places, it was mostly white had a large advantage in participation because African Americans were not informed of how to participate politically. They had never been given that right before, and Southerners kind of made it a secret and did not spread that information to them. The only places where you see it close are places like Louisiana and Florida, and then in South Carolina, Black members of political parties were actually greater, which is interesting because that's the first state to actually secede from the Union. There's also an increase in Black colleges or places of education. So this provided freedmen with an opportunity to find successful, well-paying jobs. Here in the red, it shows you former Confederate states with freedmen's bureaus and then also ones without. As you can see, majority of these states here in the center and not so much on the outside were freedmen's bureau states. If you also look in that area, they have a higher concentration of Black colleges during the Reconstruction era. There were a couple that were established before the Civil War. Those were here in the northern states like Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, and Pennsylvania. If you look in North Carolina, there's quite a few, and there's even one right here in Raleigh. 16 African Americans served on the House of Representatives between 1872 and 1901, and 2 actually served on the Senate. So this was great growth from slavery to actually making some of the country's greatest decisions. In terms of Southern politics, core voters were Black veterans, so majority of them were African Americans who fought in the Civil War. As I mentioned before, when we took a look at the political participation map, many were politically unprepared. They didn't know how to vote, where to vote, and people kind of steered them clear of those voting places. Blacks could register to vote in states since 1867, so right after the close of the war, as that was required under the Radical Republicans' way to admit states to the Union. The 15th Amendment was officially ratified or approved in 1870. This stated that in the United States, any race or color could vote. This only extended the power to men. It also said that Congress should have the power to enforce this article with appropriate legislation. This amendment, although it did give rights to all races, it did not give rights to all genders. So women's rights groups were furious that they weren't granted the vote when African Americans were. Although African Americans gained political power and also voting rights, they still had a lot of discrimination and prejudice to face, and also times of terror. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terror strategies in order to spread fear amongst African Americans, and this caused an unofficial hierarchy in the South. So it still kept the idea going that whites were more superior than blacks. They used masks like these. They used masks like these here to spread a terror image that might frighten people, and then also the concept of lynching was meant to not only physically hurt people, but also to scare people with that image. Rights were limited to African Americans in order to discourage the rights that had been given to them. They discouraged voting by taking advantage of the limitations of newly freed men. So with poll taxes, which was money that you had to pay when you went to the poll, many African Americans didn't have money because they had a hard time finding jobs, or they were sharecroppers and had no money to spend, so that prevented them from voting. However, there were a lot of Southern white people who could not pay those taxes either. So then they imposed the literacy taxes, which meant that you had to take a reading and writing test in order to, literacy test in order to vote. And former slaves actually had an issue with this because they were not allowed to learn how to read and write in most cases. Since there were some white Southerners that also could not read or write, they then issued the grandfather clause that said if your grandfather could vote, then you could vote. And as we know, they just gained that voting right, so their grandfathers could not vote. So this definitely limited voting participation amongst African Americans. There were also segregation laws that went into place that limited where African Americans could go, and also equality among races. Plessy versus Ferguson was a case where an African American was trying to fight the segregation laws, and the Supreme Court upheld them, saying that they could legally segregate based on races. So whites would have one bathroom and African Americans would have another. Jim Crow laws are an example of these segregation laws in public, and oftentimes you would have facilities that were not up to equal standards. So a dirty drinking fountain and a clean one, or schools that had broken windows and old books compared to brand new schools. This period of time was sometimes mentioned as worse than slavery, as seen in this cartoon. As African Americans continued to gain rights, they were still kept at a lower status, and many people tried ways to terrify them into not wanting to express their rights and to stay with their farmers. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 was a way to prevent some of these outrageous acts from happening. It made it a crime for any individual to deny full and equal use of public conveyances in public places. So this did help with some segregation places when they said you cannot go in here, but it didn't necessarily take care of segregation altogether. It also prohibited discrimination in jury selection, so who could serve on a jury, but it did lack a strong enforcement mechanism. So there was no way to actually enforce the Civil Rights Act. So people took advantage of it and continued to until 90 years later when we had the Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s. The end of Reconstruction was brought about by a disinterest in the Civil War, and also the South regaining some of its voice. Ulysses S. Grant as president was very scandalous. He put a lot of people in office just because they did him favors, and that scandal distracted the public from the war and also alleviated some harsh feelings between the North and the South. When Rutherford B. Hayes was elected, he lifted the military rule from the South, so now they were in control of themselves without the Union being stationed there. There's also a growth of the Democratic Party, and it gave a voice to the South, so they felt like they had that back, which was a good thing because that's what they wanted to keep to begin with. The South also had an improvement in their economy because they developed industries that didn't rely simply on agriculture. They began to manufacture their raw goods. So, for example, they take the cotton and make textile industries where they can make their own clothes instead of depending on the North. We also, in North Carolina in particular, see a rise in the furniture industry in the High Point area, and also in tobacco manufacturing, which we'll talk more about when we get to our next unit. So Reconstruction was a time that challenged both the South and African Americans as they faced new rights and new freedoms. But in the end, we did develop more legal rights for African Americans in our country, and also were able to get the South back to functioning order.